So the introduction takes you through the first 36 measures of the movement. By the second page, it is focusing on the key of D minor. And it ends with a half cadence in D minor. So, as I said, that's the nature of an introduction, is to form a dramatic contrast with the exposition. And so it's an adagio tempo, and it's going to end up focusing on D minor. So that when the exposition begins, the texture thins to just the first violins playing that syncopated motive, and the rest of the strings then give harmony underneath it, and then by the fifth measure of the allegro, of the exposition, then you hear that first motive that emerges. All right, a couple of other things to listen for is the idea of this expressive figure that's called a melodic sigh. And this is something that becomes an expressive figure, but it's somewhat stereotyped in the classical period. But we'll hear this in both the Mozart and in the Haydn symphonies. And it's a two-note figure. And it often falls by step. So it starts out with the entire orchestra just establishing the key, and then by measure 5, you have this two-note figure that's a melodic sigh. It's presented by the entire orchestra. Then you hear the strings restate it, and then the woodwinds restate it. And then you're going to hear some very expressive writing that has some melodic chromaticism. You'll see that at the bottom of the left page, where the first violins and second violins have chromatic descent, and so forth. So, you know, the effect of this opening is very, very expressive. All right. When we get to the part then that says introduction part 2, then Mozart presents a two-measure idea that he then sequences. And so he presents this over and over. You can see it presented. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. That takes you into the second page. And then it says bridge passage. That's the final passage that's going to lead to the half cadence at the end of the introduction. So the introduction has 3 main sections to it. All right. The exposition begins, and then where it says bridge passage, this particular score uses that term instead of transition. But it's at measure 71 that you begin the transition to the B theme. So what key do you expect this to modulate to? A major. What's the accidental that you're going to look for that's going to make it sound like it's modulating? G sharp, right, that raised fourth step of the scale. So when this transitional passage begins, it's restating the A theme material there. But then at the bottom of the page, we're going to start to have G sharps introduced. So you can see that on the lower page there that measure 79 and 80. And then it leads to the cadence point. One thing that's a typical classical trait is that at that cadence, when you've modulated the second key, that they'll articulate it real clearly with a chord progression, and very often they'll use rests. But what's happening in the bass is this chromatic rise leading into the cadence point. When you get to measure 95, then Mozart prefigures the B theme in the first violins. And what prefigure means is that they're anticipating the theme before the entire theme is presented. So that little three-note pattern that is being presented is in the violins, and then this is the B theme. And so that's in the key of A major. He states it, and then he restates it in A minor for a moment. So it gives it a different color. And he brings in that motive 3 when you get to measure 121. And it's a very brilliant, then, closing section. And so you see that on that last page of the exposition. And so that would be at measure 130, about measure 130. And so it ends with, real bright, exciting conclusion. All right, the development section then is the most complicated passage in the movement. And so this starts out with the first violins stating, each motive is being stated right there, can you tell? So the first one has the repeated notes, the second one has the octave leap, so it's the second motive that Mozart begins with. And the first violins and the second violins are in a canonic relationship at the beginning of the development section. So do you know that term, canonic? So a canon is a type of contrapuntal situation in which you have a leader and a follower. And so a specific type of canon is called a round. So you all know row, row, row your boat. That's the most famous example of a round. But this, so I'll put here that this is a sometimes the Latin word deux is used to refer to the leader. And then at an unspecified distance, interval as far as the time element later, then you have the follower. And the Latin word cones describes, sometimes used to define the follower. So you have, a statement of a melody and then a second voice that restates that same melody, a measure or a beat or however long between them. So this particular example is one in which the follower enters at a certain interval. Yes, Cal? This is more specific to just a situation where you have this two voices or possibly three voices, that are in this relationship. So a fugue has that type of writing in it, but it's a more free use of, that. So this is more of a strict situation where you have a leader and a follower. Yeah, but they're both polyphonic types. All right. So the way that you described then the relationship between the leader and the follower is by looking at the interval that exists between the first note of the leader and the first note of the follower. And you describe that interval and then whether it's above or below the starting pitch of the leader. So what would this particular canon, how would you describe this? This would be a canon at the seventh below. So that follower comes in at the interval of a seventh below. So the leader sounds an A measure later, then the follower has a B, that's a seventh below. And so if you compare those lines, you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that they're in that canonic relationship for 6 measures. So the use of the term canon can refer to a particular type of form, in which the entire work is comprised of a canon. So Bach wrote canons, and he was one of the great masters, if not the greatest master of the canon. So his epic landmark keyboard work, the Goldberg Variations, has 30 variations. Each variation that is divisible by the number 3 is a canon. And by dividing the number 3 into those that are every third, then it tells you the interval of the canon. So the third variation is a canon at the unison. The sixth variation is a canon at the second. And it does that all the way through variation 27, which would be a variation at the ninth. And so they're canonic through the whole variation. So that's an example of a canon. So you use the term canonic to refer to a canon-like passage within a work that's not a canon, but it's just a passage that resembles a canon, okay? So this starts out with that canonic relationship at the beginning based on motive 2. Then when you get to measure 156, then what does Mozart present in the strings, in the first violins? Motive 1. And what's sounding against that in the other voices? So like in the bassoons, motive 2, and then you even have some canonic writing that's going on a measure later in the flutes and oboes, which also is motive 2. And so you have both of those motives that are going on in that phrase. And then when you get to measure 162, you see in the first and second violins, motive 3, and then you get to the bottom 4 measures of that page, and you can see that you have all 3 motives that are going on at the same time. So it's pretty amazing the way that Mozart weaves these themes together. One of the things about this movement is that it features the basic proportions of the expectations of the sonata allegro form in the classical period. And so let's have this in your notes. The introduction is 36 measures. Exposition is about 105 measures. The development is 64 measures. And then the recap, and it has a really brief codetta, is 94 measures. So this is real typical, that the development is half to 2/3 the length of the exposition, and that the exposition and the recap are approximately the same length as far as the number of measures. All right, so the first half of the development is very active in dramatic and exciting. It reaches a cadence point at measure 189, where it says development section 3. The texture thins at that point, and that's the end of the real, thick polyphonic development. And then this is setting up the final passage of the development. And so what was the name again of the final passage? Was retransition. So when you get to the point where you have at measure 195 that you have the dominant pitch in the cello and the basses, the lower strings, that dominant pedal tone is held underneath while then the music descends to the recap that occurs at measure 208. At measure 208, then you have that feeling of release, that you're finally back to tonic, and then you're expecting all the themes to be restated. So psychologically, the way it works is that the composer kind of breaks apart all the themes and just starts going through a variety of keys, kind of, confuses you as far as what's, where are you? And at the end, then we'll return to tonic and then put things back together with a restatement of the theme. So you have that sense of emotional release. So pretty much the way that Mozart brings back all his themes is pretty straightforward. There's nothing that's unusual in the recap. So let's listen to this great first movement of the Prague Symphony. Melodic sigh. Your changing point theme era.